Now we're going to talk about the three phases of sprinting. And it's really important to break it down by three phases because if we're talking about your sprinting technique, there's no one technique you do the entire time you're sprinting. Because there are these different phases, we have different techniques or different goals for each one. And so when we're coaching or we're designing drills, we can actually pick drills that target one of these phases more than others. So what are our three phases? We have our starting phase, we have our acceleration phase, and then we have what we call our max velocity phase, or maintenance of max velocity. So they're kind of what they sound like. The starting phase, you are not moving or you're in a stationary position. You're in the blocks if we're talking sprinting, and then you have to start moving. You have to go from a dead stop to moving. Okay, that's going to have a very different technique and it's going to have very different goals than when we get into our later on moving and we already have some momentum and we're trying to add more to it. So when we're talking about sprinting, typically we're talking about you're in this really flat trajectory, you're launching yourself out. Okay, after you launch yourself out and you're going that direction, the acceleration phase kicks in. And you're not going to be as horizontal as you were in your starting phase. You'll start to be a little bit more vertical, but you're still going to be putting a lot of force backwards to generate that velocity and get yourself moving faster and faster. So if we're thinking about putting force into the ground, if we push straight down, we go up. If we push straight back, we go out. Well, if we're talking about acceleration and we're talking about getting velocity, velocity is all about going out. And so when you go into your acceleration phase, you're going to be pushing further back than you are going to be putting further down. When you get to your top velocity and you're moving as fast as possible, now what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize the amount of time or the number of times you make contact with the floor, right? Because every time you make contact, you're going to be slowing yourself down. And so when you get to your max velocity phase, you're going to be much more upright when you're sprinting so that you have fewer contacts. And it's almost like you're jumping and you're gliding as you're going down the track. And that's going to help reduce that braking effect. Okay, so we have our starting phase from 0 to just getting the movement associated. We have your acceleration phase where now you're going from that slower speed and you're trying to ramp it up and you're really pushing down and back to get yourself moving fast. And we have your max velocity phase where you're trying to keep that velocity as much as possible. You're trying to reduce the amount of braking forces you have that are slowing you down. Now, if we're talking about how long it takes you to get to your max velocity, so how long should your acceleration phase, when do you reach your max velocity? If we're talking about someone who is untrained, so most people in this course who are not sprinters, you're going to reach your max velocity at about 10 to 35 meters. And so at about 10 to 35 meters, if we had you running all out, we would find that you're not going to be increasing in your velocity after you reach those 30 meters, right? 30, 35. You're going to be running, but you're no longer going to keep getting faster. If we look at a high level, not even Olympic level athlete, but just someone who competes at a very high level in sprinting, you can see that they can accelerate for 80 meters. So if we're looking at a 100-meter dash, right, they're going to be accelerating for about 80% of that race. So they're going to be getting faster and faster, and they're probably going to reach their peak velocity, their max amount of speed, right near the end of that race. And so this is just something to conceptualize. We have these three phases. So we have our starting phase, the acceleration, and your max velocity phase. And each one has a slightly different goal. All right, when we're talking about our sprinting technique, we need to understand a couple things. So when we're looking at our leg, if we're sprinting and if we're running, you'll notice that your leg starts in contact with the ground and then it's going to come off the ground. And so when it comes off the ground and it's no longer in contact, we call that your flight, right? Because it's in flight, it's no longer in contact. While your left leg is in the air though, your right leg is going to stay in contact with the floor, right? So while my left leg is in flight, my right leg is in contact, we're going to call that your support. So we have our flight, it comes up, it comes down, it makes contact, now it's in support. So my other leg can go up into flight, this one's supporting, this one's in flight, it comes back down, and it's back and forth like this. So this paired flight and support between your legs, we call those strides. Okay, strides have to do with this completion between moving into the air and then planting into the ground, moving into the air and planting into the ground. Now, when we look at an individual stride, we really care about two characteristics of each stride. We have our stride length, how far we're traveling. So if we look at I'm standing here and I'm starting this point and then I reach out and I step here, right? The stride length is from where my starting position was to my ending position. We also care about stride frequency. This has to do with how many strides you're taking in a given amount of time. So if I'm standing here and I go 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, that would be 3 strides in however long it took me to do that, a few seconds. So we have the stride length and we have the stride frequency. Now, when you're sprinting, you're going to have different goals as far as your stride length and your stride frequency. We know that when you are trying to accelerate and you're trying to move yourself very quickly, right? We're trying to build up that speed. We said we want to have more contact with the ground. Well, more contact with the ground is an increased stride frequency, right? We take more steps in a given amount of time. We're able to produce more of that force. We're able to generate that velocity. And so when you're doing your acceleration phase, you typically have a higher stride frequency so you can build up that velocity. Conversely, or after you reach that high level of velocity, we want to decrease that stride frequency and we want to increase your stride length, right? So the length or how far you travel between each contact, right? Because we said that each time your foot makes contact with the ground when you're at max velocity, it's going to act like a brake, it's going to try to slow you down. Well, if we can travel a further distance in between the number of steps we take, we're going to have to take fewer steps in our race. So if we think about it this way, stride length and stride frequency are inversely related. So if we take bigger steps, so let's say we marked out 100 feet. If we step a greater distance, right, we're going to take fewer steps to reach that 100 feet. Versus if we take shorter baby steps, it's going to take us way more steps because the stride length is lower. So if we increase one, we generally are going to decrease the other and vice versa. So when we start running, we're going to take shorter steps and we're going to take a lot of them versus as we start building up that velocity, we're going to go from these bunch of short steps really fast, those chop steps, to those longer strides as we're going down, as we're racing. Now, if we're looking at trained individuals who run at the Olympic level, they have been shown to have greater stride length and greater stride frequency than their untrained counterparts. So they're better at taking longer steps and they can take more steps in that given amount of time than someone else. Now, the interesting thing though is that if we compare the two, the thing that really differentiates between high-level performers and low-level performers is your stride length. So they are able to take a much longer stride without influencing their stride frequency, and so they actually win their races faster because they travel in the same number of steps. They're able to travel further, and so they're able to win that race. And so stride length and stride frequency in trained individuals are higher, but generally speaking, the stride length is what differentiates and helps them win in those races. Now, let's talk practicality. And this is a really cool concept when we're talking about stride length versus stride frequency. When a beginner tends to run, we see a lot of what we call overstriding, where they take too big of a step. And if you're running and you take too big of a step, you're actually, it kind of works like a brake, right? Like if you're running down a hill, you put your foot out like this to stop yourself. Well, if you're going too far and you overstride, you're actually going to be slowing yourself down as you're trying to run. And so that can be a big problem. And so with beginners, I actually really enjoy and recommend having them run on a slight incline. And it doesn't have to be like a really steep hill, but just a subtle hill. Why? Because if you run up a hill, or if you have a hill, I recommend you try it. Try running up that hill. What you'll notice is because your body is angled, you can't take as big of a step, and so you actually will get a shorter stride length. Right? So as you're running up a hill, your steps kind of get shorter and closer together. So it really helps you focus on that acceleration in that shorter span of time. Conversely, if we put you on a decline or you're running downhill, your stride length actually increases, right? And part of that has to do with just the braking forces we talked about earlier. And so if we want to manipulate someone's stride length, one of the ways we can do this is we can have them either run at an incline or a decline. So again, running up a hill, you're going to get shorter steps. Running down a hill, you're going to get a longer step. And the general problem with beginners is they take too long of a stride. They do that overstriding, especially early on in their running, and that can cause injuries and that can cause different problems.